Hey everyone, can you hear me? Hi, thanks for tuning in for our first online TAFF Talk of 2020. We're excited today to get into the topics of film and representation and hear from our guests who will have a lot to share from their collective experiences. So you guys might want to take notes. I just want to thank all our hosts who have helped make this event possible. Shout out to the LA and DC chapters of Taiwanese American professionals, as well as Taiwan Academy for all your support to keep TAFF going strong into its fourth year. We're hosting an all digital online festival showcase this year, and we're looking forward to inviting everyone to our festival in October later this fall. So submissions are open on Film Freeway for you to get a chance to be part of our shorts competition. Our first deadline is on August 15th, and we will post the link in the chat. So I just want to take some time to introduce our guests today. We have Kenny, Nancy, and Jason here. Hello.
Hello,
Hey
thank you
guys.
everybody for coming.
Yeah.
Hi.
Thanks. So I'll just take turns introducing everyone. We have Kenny Leu, who's an actor with several credits under his belt, playing real people in lesser known Asian stories, some of which we'll hear about today. And we also have Nancy Wang Yuen, who is a sociologist and media scholar and author of the book Real Inequality, Hollywood Actors and Racism. And she was also recently interviewed as a media expert on PBS's Asian Americans. And last but not least, we have Jason, who is a film producer with executive credits at places like Alibaba Pictures, Jet Li Production Studio, and UTA, and has recently also founded Story Arc Pictures. So he focuses on developing and producing films and TV series featuring Asian stories with Asian leads. So clearly, we have some amazing all-stars here. What are we going to be discussing today? A lot of things, but since we only have, I don't know, 85 minutes or so, we're going to specifically be focusing on, yeah, just kind of our thoughts on the Asian American identity, right? Including our history in film and cinema. And we'll kind of get to all share our experiences being in the industry, including the challenges we face, against systemic issues. We'll talk about how we feel like we're represented, what's being reflected to us, about how we're seen. We'll talk about what it looks like to support each other as a community. And finally, we'll take some time to just talk about how we and the communities around us, whether you identify as Asian American or not, can kind of deeper value and help amplify the voices and stories of Asian Americans. So a lot of topics. So let's get to it. Why don't we start with some context? So maybe Nancy, you could kick it off, and also as like the most researched person here, could you give us some insight into the history of Asian Americans in film and TV?
So Asian American is a really big category. I'm not going to be able to cover all of the history. I will be probably focusing mostly on East Asian as well. So there's a bias there. I'll try to cover a little bit of South Asian as well. But just, in the beginning, Asian Americans were mostly represented in early Hollywood by white actors. It was called yellowface, where they would put yellowish makeup on themselves, even though, look at me, I'm not yellow, and then they would tape their eyes. And so Fu Manchu, Charlie Chan were two of the most famous actors of that, or characters of that time, that were portrayed by multiple white actors. But we did have early silent film stars like Sesue Hayakawa and Anna May Wong. And then, then we kind of just, it's like, actors are because of the Hays Code. So there was this movie production code that prevented people of color from being on screen in romantic relationships with white actors. And so that prevented a lot of leads to be able to be portrayed. Even Sesue Hayakawa and Anna May Wong, when they were on screen, they were not able to have fully developed relationships. And so most of the time they were tokenized, or if Sesue Hayakawa was on screen, he was seen as a villain. He was, although he was exoticized and very, very beloved and was a matinee idol. So he was actually pretty big at the same time as Rudolph Valentino. And so that was really, I mean, I think it's still surprising today when we have kind of an emasculation of Asian American men that's been going on, you know, for decades. And so, you know, and then we think about I like to kind of mark the first time we see Asian Americans portraying themselves with Flower Drum Song, which was a movie in the 1960s that was based on a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical that did really well. And if you watch it today, it's pretty campy and it's got a lot of issues, but it does get at issues of first generation immigrants versus, you know, US born. And it's got great music. I mean, some of the music is kind of, you know, ching chongy. The music was written by whites. And so I don't think of it as kind of you know, something that was created by and for. So it was maybe more about, right? And kind of through a Orientalist lens. And then we have something like, you know, we have television, and an All American Girl was kind of the first big thing that happened in the 90s. And you know, there were issues, and a lot of the community, we didn't know how to kind of read it, and there was some, I think, disagreement. And then we didn't have like another television show till Fresh Off the Boat, which was like 20 years later, right? And then Joy Luck Club was also in the 90s. So that was, for me in high school, that was the first time I ever felt like I saw myself on screen, like my story, not something from Asia, although I also watched like a lot of Gong Li movies with Zhang Yimou. And so I just see my, like, I guess my image, but I didn't necessarily see my experience as an Asian American. And Joy Luck Club really provided that. And then, you know, fast forward to Crazy Rich Asians, and we have the Mindy show. And so more and more contemporary creators are Asian American, right? We're telling our own stories. And I think that makes a big difference. I mean, we had indies also throughout this whole time. Like we think about Better Luck Tomorrow, you know, and all the Asian American film festivals, including, you know, this film festival, are such important places for Asian American voices to be able to be exposed and hopefully, you know, get wider exposure and just viewership, you know, within the community and also beyond the community. So that's like a Cliff Notes version of
great.
Asian American history.
Yeah. That's awesome. No, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I'd love to hear you know, from Jason and then Kenny. You know, Jason, I know you have quite a bit of experience, right? What is some light you could shed on the cross-cultural context that you've experienced with companies, domestic and overseas?
Right. So I think my experience is that I think it's very important for us as Asian Americans to find our own journey, but also to realize what we can do here in the US as Asian Americans, but also look to our heritage if we have that potential or have that possibility or have those connections. So early in my career, I had the opportunity I worked for Jet Li, and at that time I was able to go to Shanghai and lived in China, worked in Shanghai and Beijing, and discovered all that world over there. And even in my childhood, I grew up also I remember watching Jackie Chan movies in the theaters when I was in Taiwan. And that was an amazing contrast because I would go to Taiwan in the summers and see those films and discover that world of content. And then when I came back for the school year to the US, actually, I was quite naive at the time. I was just a kid. I was like, how come people don't get to see these films? They're so awesome. And it's fresh and different. You know, it's not one is better than the other, but they're also good. So how come people don't get to enjoy these types of content, those actors, those jokes here? And then when you grow up, you kind of learn more about why that is, right? So I think it's very important to find representations for ourselves that we can aspire to and find confidence in. So my experience, I've worked at Disney, I've worked as a producer, or when I was working with Jet Li, I've worked as an executive when I was at Alibaba, I've been in this industry my entire career, almost 20 years. Asian American is that for a long time, first of all, we don't have the numbers, right? We're not a plurality or a majority. And then the other thing is that there's so few Asian Americans in this industry. I think it's gotten a lot better over the last 20 years as I've experienced. But even today, as I look across the industry, when I see Asian Americans, still relatively very few. And the ones that I see are usually in more, I would say, support roles. And so it's, I think, something that I think is coming from lower moment. So then we need to figure out how to continue to tell our stories and to find out what our stories are. I think there's also a component of, for a long time, Hollywood is a very gated industry. And so you have to find your way in. And then once you find your way in, we have to show what our stories mean, you know, and there's a whole wide range. And I think that's the beauty. And that's why we can, even though there's a lot of things that we need to fix, there's a lot of optimism because there's such a wide range of perspectives of stories that we can tell. Like looking at something like Fresh Off the Boat versus The Farewell versus Crazy Rich Asians versus movies more recently like Hustlers or Simple Favor or Last Christmas or Big Sick. Like these show such a gamut of films of potentials with Asian Americans. And not all films, for example, need to tell a very Asian story, right? I'm looking forward to the day, like it's almost like this progression. We can go from the Crouching Tiger, and then hopefully we can get to a day, do we have a Asian action hero? Well, just an action hero who happens to be Asian, right?
Yeah, Simu Liu.
There you go.
Yeah, that's awesome. No, I appreciate that you mentioned optimism, you know. I think it is definitely takes a bit of work to acknowledge our recent successes, right? But they also can't be taken for granted. Yeah, so I love that. And thank you for sharing, you know, a bit of your history and your background. I think that that's really exciting to hear. Kenny, do you want to share a little bit about your experiences as an actor, you know, like what type of roles you have or haven't been offered?
Yeah, absolutely. As an Asian actor, you know, it's first coming to Hollywood. My background is actually in engineering. Like I had a whole career prior to doing acting, and so I kind of have seen it from the outside as well as the inside. And something that is very apparent with, you know, being an Asian male actor is that you kind of get the sense that America kind of doesn't really have a hat to hang on when they're understanding Asians. So then like their understanding and their image of us is very pixelated. You know, like there's very limited exposure to us. So then they kind of see us in these stereotypes or whatever is popular. Like, you know, it's very commonly discussed of us, you know, being, especially the men, like being nerdy, like helpless guys, emasculated, or like the evil foreigner. We've discussed that a lot before. But then something that I discovered moving into this industry was whenever they were looking for, like, let's say a good looking Asian guy or something, I found that we were getting typecast a lot in having gay roles. Like I was never offered any kind of roles besides ones that were homosexual. And it's not something that is discussed very often because it's kind of like, well, what's wrong with being homosexual? There really is nothing except that there's such a limited amount of understanding about us that if you are even like decently good looking as a man, then they're like, okay, well, he's got to be gay. And I've got like some really real stories that we can get very vulgar with. Jason knows one of them. And I was offered a part from a very well-known casting director. This was when I first moved here, and even just getting an audition in one of these casting offices is a huge deal. And I get a phone call from this casting director, and she's like, oh my God, we're looking for a good-looking Asian guy, and you are perfect for the part. And then obviously I pick up the phone and I'm like, oh, hey, this is, yeah, you want me? You want me? Well, okay, well, what kind of part are you looking for? and then she's like, oh yeah, well this is, we're just casting something on the side. It's not for a big TV show, so it's you're volunteering your time, but it's with some really well-known people. And I was like, oh yeah, hit me. What is it? And then she goes, well, the character is homosexual. And I'm like, oh, okay, well that's all right. And then she says, yeah, he's doing a sexual act during the film. And I'm like, oh, okay, well that's fine too, I guess. And then she goes, yeah, there's a blowjob involved. And I'm like, okay, well, tell me that I'm the one that's receiving it at least. And she goes, no, you're giving it. And then I'm like, well, what is this part? Like what other lines? And she goes, yeah, there's a line. And I'm like, what is it? And she's like, it's yes, sir. And it's this guy who's a servant in a house. And he's blowing a white businessman's dick underneath his desk, and that was my first introduction to Hollywood. That was the only role to this day, the only role that I've been offered. And obviously it's like very disappointing. But then it also speaks to kind of the challenges that we have, having such a limited perception of like who we can be. Yeah, and I can't tell you how many times I've auditioned for Bruce Lee. Like my first 3 years here, I auditioned for Bruce Lee 5 times for all different projects. I've been called, I've been stopped on the street by strangers who were like, oh, you look just like Jackie Chan. I've gotten Jackie Chan, Jet Li, Bruce Lee, John Cho, Dante Basco, Daniel Day Kim, and Rick Yuen on multiple occasions by complete strangers. And it's not even just non-Asians. Actually, it came from Asian people as well. And so it really speaks to how limited of an understanding there are for us. Because if I can look like anybody, then who are you really seeing me as? So yeah, I think the only roles that we're offered are these types where you're only offered roles if your image precedes you, like you've got a reputation. And right now in America, I feel like Asian stereotypes are so dominant that it's difficult to have your personal qualities shine through. And I think that is what is really disappointing for us as Asian people, that we have individualities and these personal qualities that we just can't share because our Asianness precedes who we are. That's kind of been my experience entering Hollywood.
Wow. Jason, Nancy, you guys have anything to add?
It's hard to share those stories. Yeah. Oh, Nancy, sorry, go ahead.
Just only thinking about the queer character that casting you and actually not casting a queer actor in that role is an issue. And then of course the kind of interracial dynamics that you described of the literal servicing is it speaks to the kind of diminishing of Asian Americans across sexuality lines, and just it's there's so many. I just had so many thoughts when you were telling that. It's very wow, this is like what a panel. I don't think I've been on a panel where that's like the first story that we're discussing. But anyway,
I wanted to break the ice and make sure that we had no limits.
But yeah, I mean, there's the kind of intersections of race, gender, sexuality that Asian Americans deal with because of what you mentioned, Kenny, the very limited roles. So.
Yeah, and one thing I want to point out is I've been watching during this time where we're all home. I've been watching a lot of older films like Bruce Lee films, Jet Li films, and what's interesting is a lot of the storylines that they covered back then in those classic films, they're actually, they played characters that had to fight against foreign powers, and they faced a lot of racism. And so it's interesting to me to this day because now I think everyone has, now we're kind of dealing here with as Asian Americans, but it's interesting that to me that, for example, I work a lot in China, like those storylines now are almost, I don't know, but I feel they've been diminished or they've been stereotyped on that end too recently. Because I found watching the older films, the Bruce Lee, the Jet Li films, like the way they portrayed their fight and how they stood up to those foreign powers and how they were facing racism to be quite real and quite unfortunately accurate to what we're going through today. And it's interesting how even though Asian countries now are much more powerful, like I guess they've maybe, is it evolved or they've gotten over it? And when you watch cinema there now, there's not as much of that. They're able to tell just their own stories without having to deal with so much of this other burden, you know?
Yeah, I think a part of it too is that, I mean, America's a melting pot, you know, and I think something that us as an Asian community still struggle with is owning like our presence here. Like, we're American, you know, and I feel like we struggle with telling our stories and connecting ourselves to the fabric of America and saying that, like, hey, like, we've been here for a long time, we've got struggles, and speaking up kind of feels sometimes like, oh, if we're speaking up, then other people don't get their ability to say, you know, like their ability to say like, hey, we're being racist towards also. And so I think it's a matter of ownership and maybe like some spiritual or like work on our own power and our integrity to be able to speak up confidently and powerfully.
Yeah, that's really well said. I love that. Nancy or Jason, you guys have anything to add? Yeah, it's so good. I've so many thoughts running through my mind. I love to hear, more personal stories from you guys. Kenny, thank you for kind of sharing a bit of your roles. Nancy, what have you seen in some of your research and what you studied and, observed as, a sociologist?
I think that Asian Americans, I mean, we have a particular Orientalist stereotyping that we have to, battle in life as well as on screen. And I think that on-screen representations reinforce those stereotypes, right? In my research in interviewing actors, I found that actors of color overwhelmingly paid a psychological cost to having to portray stereotypes that they know would make their people look bad. Right. So Asian Americans, but a lot of the actors of color, so actors, they don't have a lot of power, right? They just are supposed to do the role. I mean, they can have a take on it, but they didn't create the role most of the time, right? If they're being cast in something. And it's a risk to kind of speak up and say like, hey, this is racist. And so I found that a lot of the actors of color, and if we're thinking about Asian American actors, they wouldn't come out and say that, hey, this is racist, but they'll say things like, like, for example, one guy was, one Asian American guy, he was, it was set in Virginia, and then they wanted him to wear some sort of, Asian Chinese stereotyped outfit, right? And he's like, these are really comfortable. They were like robes of some sort, some silk robes stuff. He's like, and he said to the director, these are really comfortable, but I don't think that we would dress like this in Virginia. I think I would try to, fit in and wear something more Western. And so they would invoke the authenticity of the story rather than calling out, racism. And I mean, this was many years ago. Perhaps actors are more comfortable with that, but I highly doubt it, just because, I think people on set don't want to be accused of being racist. I mean, racist is kind of like a bad word these days, even though, we're definitely in the midst of grappling with with the racism that has been defining the United States for so long. But I think that for actors of color and Asian American actors who have to deal with the kind of exoticization, the having to speak with accents. I know over and over again, the actors of color said that essentially every role that they audition for, they're asked to speak with an accent, even though I would venture to say majority of the actors talk like, all of us here, where we speak with, I guess, Californian accents or whatever, we're not speaking with whatever, immigrant accents, which I don't have any problems with, right? But I think that what's interesting though, is that the accents that they expect are actually, if you trace the origins of them, they're coming out of those yellow-faced characters who are making fun of Chinese accents, right? And so anybody who kind of gets reduced to that very, very demeaning, right? It's usually the accent is like a joke. So it's like the comedic relief rather than, it's not funny when someone is trying to learn English and speaking with an accent. That actually just means that they're multilingual, right? And yet we see that as, I think we're programmed, we're brainwashed into thinking that that's comedic when someone speaks English with an international accent. Although European accents are thought of as sophisticated and cool, but Asian accents are somehow diminished, and so all of that is based on just decades of I guess a century of stereotyping.
Yeah, really well said. I mean, I'm curious to hear more from Kenny, and some of the roles that you've played. Have you had any better experiences than the one that you shared in casting and in other roles?
Yeah, I mean, when I speak to actors that have been in Hollywood like 10 years before me, I can tell that the scene was so much more dismal than it is now. So I actually feel very lucky to be able to be a part of this. This whole movement to recognize like Asian American stories as something that is valid, something that is bankable, something that America wants to see. Like we're all a part of it right now, and we've been struggling to have something like that since the beginning of Hollywood. So in that way, I'm like super privileged to be a part of something like this. At the same time, something that is uniquely like Asian American, and I think differentiates us from like being a part of the Asian film industry, is that sometimes I do feel like we're kind of stuck in between. For example, like one of my latest films, Midway, it came out last year. It's a World War II blockbuster by Roland Emmerich, who did Independence Day. In that, they decided to make everything super biographical. So it was like almost like watching a documentary. Is kind of like the way they wanted to present like all the scenes. And so I portray a real Chinese hero. He's a poor school teacher who lived in the middle of nowhere in the countryside in China. And one day, this very famous American pilot named Captain Doolittle crash lands in China, and they're about to execute him. The Chinese army captures him and is about to execute him, thinking that he's a spy for anybody. But then, because Zhu Xue San happens to speak a little bit of English, he saves his life. And not just that, like he helps to make sure that Doolittle gets escorted back to America. The thing is that because he does that, the Japanese army ends up finding out and ends up slaughtering his family. And so for me, it was like this very human story where this poor Chinese guy like decides to empathize with this American pilot, and he risks his life, he risks his whole family to make sure that somebody is taken care of. And for me, it was like this very heartwarming, like human story that crosses racial boundaries and geopolitics. However, like the reviews for Midway, whenever they do mention the Chinese like sequence, all they would say is, oh yeah, well, Midway took some Chinese money, so all of that is clearly propaganda. And it's really disappointing to me because it kind of just shines a light to me on how I kind of feel like we're sometimes not even seen as like human. Like we can't really be fully empathized with, because whenever you do have kind of sympathy for an Asian person or a Chinese person, oh, it's propaganda, because we're so alien that we can't be human. That's the sense that I get. And then, but what is really ironic is that although Americans were calling it propaganda, when they released the Chinese version of Midway, they had cut the whole segment out because the army that was portrayed in the movie was the nationalist army and not the communist army. So here we are as Asian Americans, like trying to tell a human story, trying to have us be relatable too, and we're stuck in between like this mess, So yeah, we have like a very unique struggle, and I think that it's important that we're aware of that.
Yeah. Wow. Jason, I'd love to hear your thoughts between the international and American view of storytelling. Yeah.
On that, I think we just need more at bats. So we all have to try to get more. they want to be cross-cultural or whether they're just Asian American stories, like we just have to do more of them because the more people see, the more this can hopefully at some point not only have more success, but also get normalized. Yeah, like what Kenny says, for sure, because, especially in the last 10 years, because of the Chinese money, Hollywood has tried to make these Chinese co-productions because Chinese co-productions have all these benefits, more revenue and also slots in the theaters and all this kind of stuff. But, a lot of those have been quite embarrassing. Like the biggest one was called The Great Wall. And if anyone has seen The Great Wall, we could have a whole nother discussion on that, but that was pretty disastrous. But then, Hollywood has tried, there have been some Marvel films that have done that. An example of one that has really hit and kind of done kind of well recently actually was The Meg. And you could have your thoughts on whether that was a really good movie, but it made a boatload of money. And actually the story-wise, it was actually quite well done and kind of balancing and just showing characters that, yeah, they weren't necessarily seen as propaganda, as just an entertaining film. So I think we just need much more at bats because without understanding the culture, without living there, without having these experiences, Hollywood executives, aren't going to get it. And even if they try with best intentions, it's difficult. And most of the time, they're busy doing, a million different things, so they don't have the time to have the best intentions, right? They're just trying to get something made and hopefully it makes money. I think from my perspective, I can speak to it, I think, two stories. So one earlier in my career when I was working with Jet Li, and this movie I'll bring up, but I actually didn't work on it when I was with him. It predates when I worked with him, but I think it's part of Asian American canon. When we talk about the movie Romeo Must Die, right? When you watch that movie had actually quite amazing action sequences, and especially the one between Aaliyah and Jet Li. They had a fight sequence together. That was really innovative. Like if you go back and watch that now, it's really cool. But the lasting memory for me of that film is actually Romeo Must Die was loosely based on the story of Romeo and Juliet. So throughout the movie, there's kind of this hint at a romance between the Jet Li and Aaliyah character, but they never consummate their romance. And they actually shot two endings, one where they just kissed and one where they hugged. And it's very interesting because Warner Brothers said when they did the test with the kiss, they said the audiences reacted poorly to that. So they changed it to a hug. And that's interesting, right? Because as executives, and this is why executives have so much, I don't know if it's power, but right, they have influence, right? Because the executive there could have taken that, or the studio could have taken that and said, no, we believe that that's what we want for the story, and we're going to put it out there, and we're going to try to normalize that. But instead, because Hollywood is, they're all publicly owned companies, and I think because of that, there's some risk aversion. They cut it, so it was a hug, right? And so actually, there's a lot of online discussion about that, and I think one of the lasting memories is about that film, because why was that so? Why did audience have that reaction? So I think we need to look at the media, we need to look at the executives in charge, and we need to look at the audience too, right? So there's a lot of I think reflection and work to be done. But in a more recent example, when I was working at Alibaba, I worked on a film called A Dog's Purpose, and that film did very well in China. It broke all sorts of records. And the great thing about that film is it's a part of a book trilogy. So the second film I got to be involved in from the ground up. And in the source material for the book, there was a Chinese family and a Chinese kid. And I got to work with the production company that made it was Amblin. So this is Steven Spielberg's company. I was really afraid actually, because what happens so often is that the characters are whitewashed. So first of all, don't whitewash the family. And because the film did so well, the first film did so well in China, they were not going to do that. But then secondly was to make sure, so I had to work with them and I asked them, like, how can we make this boy, because he had a very small role in the book, how can we make him into a bigger character? Because that would be really interesting. And the story takes place in Middle America. So the thing is, not only can we try to make this character have a bigger role, but he doesn't have to be like an immigrant, or he doesn't have to be some super Chinese out version drinking boba or something, right? So at the end of the day, you know, worked with Amblin, we all worked with the writers, and we just crafted a story. He's become, the main story is a young girl's coming of age story. The young Chinese boy is her best friend growing up. So at the end of the day, he becomes the male romantic love interest for her, and they get together at the end of the movie. And the only part that's Chinese about him is there's one line of dialogue when he's a kid, he speaks to his parents in Chinese, and that's it. And otherwise, that's the point, is to show that that's the full gamut. Like a Chinese character can also play a boy next door in Middle America, because that is actually what's authentic for the story. And if you think about it, we all know friends that have grown up in all the different states that are Asian. So it's not like we don't exist or that's not inauthentic. It's totally authentic. It's just usually the camera is not pointed at those type of stories. And we need to work for that. So as an executive, when I was at Alibaba, I needed to work for that to make that change. And now as a producer, that is my goal. And there's so many stories. That's the exciting thing, because they've been neglected. And so they're just sitting there, and we need to pick them up and run with those stories.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more too. What is your development process like currently, now that you started Story Arc, it's your own thing, how do you seek these unique stories that you want to bring to the table?
Yeah, I think there's so many ways, because Hollywood, there's not just one way to get a movie made. So right now I've just started pretty much right now bootstrapping things a little bit. And for me right now, it's about identifying writers that have written scripts that I really resonate with. So because I've been in the industry, I know a certain amount of writers or writer-directors, and I can find these stories, and I'm reading a lot, and I'm finding stories that I can then come on, work with the writers, the writer-directors, to then further develop them so that they're ready, so that we can get financing, and then get them going. And for me, I'm looking at the whole range. I think the type of stories that I want to tell are stories that have a universal humanity, so that they can be commercially driven. So they're not just for the Asian American community, but that anyone will watch this and find the stories interesting and engaging. And I think that is also one point. Like, we have to believe that our stories are worth telling. And recently I got that huge inspiration when I watched what happened with The Farewell and Lulu Wang. And when you hear, like, I encourage everyone to go and just YouTube like Lulu Wang, like her acceptance speeches or her interviews, because she has, whatever you think about that movie, good and bad, and the movie is excellent anyways, but she is so inspirational because she's so certain of her story. And I think it took her a while too, because she's also not ashamed to tell that at some point she was very down in the dumps about that. So I think it's important to see that we all have that arc. It's really hard to do this job, and as an actor, as any job is hard, and this industry is also very hard. So you can get down on yourself, but then figure out things that you can get inspired to. So right now I'm looking at scripts and working with writers, but also in the back of my mind, and all the time when I hear about cool stories, I have a list of and files. Like, I have at least like 50 other projects that I'm like, at some point when my company gets going more, I can have some development funding. I have even more as a track record as a producer, as an independent producer. I can hire writers and we can break these stories, and they're all over the gamut. They can be dramas, they can be comedies, there's action films. And actually, for action films, that's one of the areas that I think have a lot of opportunity, because I want to take back the power for action films, because as an Asian American male, I think growing up, you are like ching chong to death, or like called Bruce Lee to death, and you find it embarrassing. I never took martial arts as a kid, but I can relate to that. And you know, having worked with Jet Li, I know how awesome those stories can be, and how much room there is still to go in those stories. And because I think that's something that we're just really good at, like these action films, like we need to like take back that power and develop modern action films, whether they're just action or martial arts, but action films are just this amazing category that we can tell a lot of stories with.
Yeah, that's awesome. No, I love that. Yeah, Kenny or Nancy, I'm curious what other Asian American stories, and Jason too, that you guys know of that maybe you feel like continue to go untold in like film and television.
Well, I talked right before Jason, so Nancy, I'll give you the opportunity to take this turn, but I have one after you.
Okay, so I think about when are we going to get an Oscar again? You know, Asian Americans, right? Because we've only had a few Oscar like acting Oscars, and the last Asian woman was in the 50s with Yoshi Umeki. It was called Sayonara, totally problematic movie. And so I think we don't have enough historical picks, right? Because those are I mean, if you think about the best picture winners, a lot of them have been, especially the American stories, have been historical stories. And we don't have any that I can think of that's been like a big budget. Like we don't have a Selma, we don't have a, you know, a Malcolm X movie. We don't have, I mean, we have historical figures, but like everything else, you know, those are underrepresented in our history books. If you guys have seen the Asian Americans PBS documentary, oh my gosh, there are so many stories there that can be mined. I mean, I think about when I took Asian American film in graduate school, I think the story of Vincent Chen was one that struck me, this kind of hate crime against, you know, a Chinese American who was mistaken for Japanese American during the Detroit, you know, auto downturn, and they blamed the Japanese, and then they brutally murdered this guy, Vincent Chen, and they got off. They didn't even, you know, they didn't even go to jail. They didn't serve a day of jail time. So, and then it galvanized an entire Asian American movement in the 80s. And so that story, you know, hasn't been told. I mean, I think maybe this year or next year, there's going to be a graphic novel that's coming out. So we're still at the point where we are not, those stories are not being told in narrative form, right? So we don't have a kind of big studio epic films like, you know, we think about, you know, the Japanese American story, right? I mean, there have been movies, but I feel like they haven't been really told from our perspective. There have been a lot of documentaries that have been told by Asian Americans. So like I said, the recent PBS docuseries for 5 episodes is fantastic. Before we came on, we were talking about Arthur Dong, who had the Hollywood Chinese is a documentary. I remember watching, what was the movie? Forbidden USA, about these early, I think they were San Francisco, Chinatown, they were what are they called? Nightclub dancers and singers. And I remember watching it. So this is about, so the representation isn't just it's for us too, not just for the public, but I saw it, and I used to be really into classic musicals. Like I love Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers when I was a kid. And then when I watched this documentary, I realized I did not think that Asians could dance for some reason. Like when I saw it, they looked just like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. I was like, wow. I was shocked. And I realized I was shocked because I had never seen that. I didn't imagine it. And I realized that I had blinders on because of the lack of representation that we grew up with in the United States. So we are growing up with a deficit of even understanding ourselves and our potentials, right? So documentaries are so important to fill that gap. And hopefully narrative films eventually, right?
Yeah. That's the hope. What were we going to say, Kenny?
Yeah, so that's actually the perfect segue to what I was going to mention for personal stories or movies. So I've actually got a film coming out next month called A Shot Through the Wall. It's 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 directed by yeah, it's directed by a female Chinese American director named Amy Long, who is amazing, and man, she's like younger than I am. She's like so incredibly talented. And this film is a historical type of like narrative drama. It's inspired by the Peter Liang case from 2016. Well, it's fictional, but then it's inspired by this case. And so I think it's so important to, you know, be able to tell our own stories, not just own it, but also be able to talk about the uncomfortable stories. Because in this one, if you're not familiar, Peter Liang is the Peter Liang case in 2016. He was a New York City Chinese American cop who was responsible for accidentally shooting and killing a black man. In his case, it truly was an accident. He was in his first week of being a cop, and he gets sent to patrol like the project of the projects type area in New York. And then he goes into this dark stairwell because he hears a noise, and he has his gun drawn, and then he hears a noise and it like freaks him out, and then there's no lights inside of the stairwell. So he accidentally discharges his firearm into a wall, and then this bullet like ricochets around the stairwell, goes down a flight of stairs, and hits a black man in the chest and the heart, and he dies. And it's horrible, and he's responsible for killing him. But this happens in the middle of 2016 Black Lives Matter, and so he's like caught up in a lot of the political aftermath, because despite all of that, he is the only cop to be indicted by a grand jury for manslaughter. They like clearly threw this Asian guy under the bus. You know, you have a lot of white police officers that have been serving on the force for a very long time, handcuffing people, throwing them on the ground, shooting them in the back, or they're running away and then shooting them in the back. And then nobody gets indicted by a grand jury except for this hella young, hella Chinese, like Chinese American cop. And so that he's kind of like caught up in the midst of all that. And so it's just like a really horrible situation to be in. And our movie is basically inspired by that, and it's about ending police violence. So it's just such a sensitive topic, you know. And so then like something that we really struggled with was we had a lot of the like most major film festivals say we can't program your movie, like the topic is too sensitive. And on top of that, we've got too many Asian American stories already. And then I'm like, where? But yes, and it really struggled until we did finally get accepted by the Bentonville Film Festival, and it's going to be premiering next month. The festival is from August 10th to August 16th. I don't know when exactly it's going to be playing, but I'm really proud of that movie because it goes to show you that it's trying to say something that that I guess people aren't used to. It's new. And so it's speaking something that is a little bit uncomfortable, but at the same time, it's also owning our own story, because in a way we do connect to everything, but we just don't talk about it. And that's why it's so difficult for people to understand it and to program it into like a film festival.
Wow. Thanks for sure.
I want
Peter? Kenny?
What is that?
You played Peter?
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, it's not Peter Liang. It's like a completely different story. It's completely fictional, but I am the Chinese American cop.
Wow, interesting. Yeah, go ahead, Jason.
And Kenny, is it going to be on VOD, or that you don't know yet?
I don't know yet. I don't know. Yeah, it's still super early, so.
Yeah.
I just wanted to respond to something that Nancy mentioned about like the type of characters and the Asian American PBS doc series. If people haven't seen it, they should see it. But on Vincent, I think, I mean, you mentioned the graphic novel, but I think you'll be happy to know that I think a lot of people are trying to tell his story. I know of at least 4 to 5 feature scripts, and I know a couple TV series. And actually, I am working on one as well. And my angle for that story is actually, I want to tell the story of Vincent when he was alive. So his coming of age love story. So I equate it to something like a Fruitvale Station meets Romeo and Juliet, because he did have this really interesting love story. And he did have a beautiful coming of age story of what it meant to him to make it as a young man in Detroit in the 1980s. And I think that deserves to be told. And, you know, we have a great script right now, and looking using management companies about a director, and then hopefully we'll be able to talk to studios about supporting that film. But I think, yeah, like along those lines, there's just so much, like, you know, I already mentioned action films, and then Nancy, you're talking about history, and then documentaries. I know there's like just a lot of documentaries that it's very important also that we can see, like, you know, some documentaries do well, and then we could see about how we can do like a feature film version of it. Like one film that, for example, I know got some traction a couple years ago was the feature film, the documentary film about the bank in New York Chinatown. That was the only bank that was indicted for the financial crisis. And I know participant media, and I think Justin Lin, they're involved in trying to bring that story into a feature-length version. And I think that's a very important story too, because it's basically about a family. And so this guy and his 4 daughters and the Chinatown community, and it's such a rich story. So I would love to see that story.
That's awesome. Yeah, I remember you shared it with me. It's called Abacus, right?
Yeah, Abacus.
On PBS.
Yep.
That's cool. Yeah, everyone check it out if you haven't already. I feel like we're talking about so many good things right now. I just want to ask a fun question. Since we're shooting out a lot of things that we like and we've watched. Yeah, what are some films or shows that showcase Asian American stories that you guys have watched that you've enjoyed recently? I'm just curious, so I can add it to my list.
I mean, so many. Recently, there's a beautiful doc on Amazon Prime, and you should watch it. It's called Tyrus, Tyrus. It's about an animator in the 1930s. He is responsible for Bambi. But watch the film, and you'll both be inspired and probably find a new favorite artist, but also it's like heart-wrenching to watch that film because of the things that happened to him. So that's one.
Another one that we should check out too. I actually really enjoyed Kim's Convenience. I was binging that on Netflix, and I thought that was really well done because it felt, I mean, it's not Asian American, it's Asian Canadian, but I feel like the parallels are there, and it wasn't just, you know, cut and paste. You know, it wasn't like just any family that owns a convenience store. It was very specifically a Korean Canadian one. So I did feel like I was looking inside of a window to another world, basically. And I think that is the right way to represent, not just to tell any kind of story, but a story that is uniquely Asian.
Oh gosh, I have so many. I mean, I love the kind of Netflix YA ones, the Half of It and Never Have I Ever. I think most people have already seen them. They're so good. Those are like perfect quarantine, like, you know, just don't think about all the stuff that's going on if you want to, you know, diversion. But one that I think has been I haven't seen a lot of talk about it, but I'm a huge sci-fi fan. And it's called Devs. It's a series on Hulu, and it's really good. It's by the same guy who did Ex Machina, which did not, you know, portray Asian American women as the silent robot, but the same actress, Sonia, she was also in Crazy Rich Asians, right? She is the lead in Devs, and she's totally different. She's very, very well developed, and she has an Asian American love interest played by Ha Jin, who is amazing. If you guys saw the Jesus Christ Superstar with John Legend, he has the best singing voice ever. I mean, I think he was in Hamilton too, Ha Jin. If you guys haven't heard of this actor, he's Korean American, and he can sing, he can act, and I'm you know, I have like a crush on, like a screen crush on him. But Devs is, oh my gosh, it's like sci-fi at its best. It's slow, really slow. I guess, you know, people, I don't know if they do slow anymore, but I was like, I couldn't, it came out every week. I could not wait for the next episode. I was so enthralled by the series. It's like philosophical, it's about afterlife. So it's the best kind of pure sci-fi. So that's my recommendation.
I have actually a couple more. One is Babysitter's Club. I would recommend that. That was fun. And another one is Palm Springs on Hulu. I think watch it for, you know, just it's a good movie, but Chris Pang is in it, and he plays another role that doesn't need to be Asian.
Chris Pang's really small role.
It's a tiny small role, but I quit it. I was describing it as I feel
the cowboy hat.
Yeah, I feel it's like Palm Spring. That role that he played kind of was like John Cho's role in American Pie. Like, so it's a little bit iconic, I feel.
That's cool. What was the name of it, you said?
It's called Palm Springs. It's on
Springs,
Hulu.
Oh my gosh, Palm Springs is so good.
Yeah.
It's really good. It's perfect for quarantine because it's about like kind of like we're in a time warp, which is what it feels like. Like, what day is it today? I don't even know.
I love this. Okay, I have my programming ready for like the next month and a half. Very cool. Yeah, actually, Kenny, I wanted to see if you could share a little bit about another one of your roles. It was a docu-series, right? The Long Road Home, where you play Sergeant Eddie Chen. Yeah, I'd love for you to share a bit of about his story, your story getting casted in that, getting made.
Yeah. Wow, I actually wasn't prepared to talk about this one, but no, I've said it so many times, and I still get emotional thinking about it. The Long Road Home was like one of the first like larger roles that I ever had as an actor, and it's done by National Geographic. It was when they were starting to do narratives, and so The Long Road Home is about 2004 when Iraq War first starts becoming violent. You know, prior to that, American troops were inside of Iraq trying to keep the peace, trying to, you know, rebuild like parts of Sadr City, Iraq, and it's about this platoon of guys. It's like Black Hawk Down in a way, a platoon of guys that gets ambushed by 10,000 Iraqi insurgents. And what you don't know about it, especially me as an Asian American, is that there's this sergeant who was like a platoon leader inside of that little caravan of people who got pinned down. His name is Sergeant Eddie Chen. And he was like a little bit older than the rest of the guys. He was 30. He grew up in Saipan, Guam. And he was just like, everyone called him like just the happiest guy in the world. And everybody looked up to him because then he kind of took care of everybody. Like when everybody else was going through boot camp and like was really struggling, he was like, hey, you know what? Look on the bright side of things. Like, you know, things are going to be great. Things are going to be fine. And so they really respected him. But spoiler alert, what happens at the very beginning of The Long Road Home is that Sergeant Eddie Chen dies. Like he gets shot past his bulletproof vest, and then like this bullet ricochets around his chest and just like completely like destroys everything on the inside. So he dies like almost instantly. And for these guys, it was so tragic because he was like everybody's big brother, and he was like their leader. He was like the most charismatic guy that they'd ever met. And when he dies, they're like, wow, we're not going to make it out of this, are we? And it was really personal for me because when I booked it and we flew to Austin, Texas, and went to Fort Hood to start shooting everything, the Army had set up like 150 buildings to simulate Sadr City, Iraq. And I knew that, you know, a lot of the veterans that had survived that day were going to be there. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I got this big part, and, you know, I get to like, you know, act, and, you know, I'm making it. And I show up and I've done my research and everything. And I understood like the facts of what happened in my head. But then what I wasn't prepared for was that at that reunion that night, I was going to meet like a lot of these veterans. And I was like, wow, it's going to be such an honor to meet them. But when I go in, as soon as they see me, I'm the only Asian guy in this platoon. And they're like, oh shit, that's the guy who's Eddie Chen. And when I walked in there, like just imagine like these 6 foot tall, like white guys, like with big cowboy hats, big belt buckles, and like you know, like got like a very Southern, like, you know, heft to them. As soon as they saw me, like tears just started flowing down their face. And I was like, holy shit, what happened? And then they had to turn away and they're like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. You're playing Eddie, right? And I was like, yeah. And then they were like, he's the best guy I've ever known. And it's like 14 years later. And then they all held up their hands and they still had this bracelet that was rest in peace, my brother, Sergeant Eddie Chen. And a couple of them even had tattoos on their arms where they were like, you're Eddie. And it was so emotional for me because at the same time, a lot of things just kind of got dissolved in my head. You know, like I'm so used to growing up Asian American in this America where you kind of don't receive that kind of love. You know, like you're not recognized a lot of times for being somebody of that kind of emotional impact to people that aren't your kind. And it was shattering, you know, and to be able to tell that story and to be able to, you know, just represent somebody who meant so much to people was probably one of the most like important things that I feel like I've been a part of. So yeah, thanks for asking the question, Cindy.
That's amazing. Yeah, and he's a Taiwanese American, right? He was a
Taiwanese American that immigrated to Guam, Saipan, and then joined the United States Army.
That's beautiful. I love that. We can watch it on Nat Geo.
Yeah, on Nat Geo, and I believe on TNT too. I have to double check again.
Yeah, that's really cool. I love it. Yeah, I've heard it before, and I want to hear your story again. So thank you for that. Just so people are aware, you know, of what other films and docs are out there. Yeah, I'd love to hear more from Nancy. If you guys haven't read her book, please get a copy. It is so good. It will change your life, whether you're Asian American or not. Nancy, is there anything that you'd like to share with us kind of from, you know, your research, your studies, from your things that you've published, from Twitter, from your interactions that you've seen recently?
So I wrote the book, I think it came out end of 2016, right after the Oscar So White hashtag 2 years in a row, right? Where just actors of color are completely shut out of the Academy. And so much has changed since then. So I've been wanting to update it. The stories I think are still true, unfortunately, because I think racism in the industry is still slow changing. But the stats are better. So, you know, if we want to kind of leave on a, you know, high note, the numbers are way better. So I think it was about, more than a decade ago now, when I was in grad school, I looked at primetime television representations of Asian Americans, and we were way underrepresented compared to our population percentage. And just in 2016, 2017, we came out with a follow-up, 10-year later follow-up. And that, and we're actually represented according to our population, right? But we also, that's just numbers though, because we also looked at how, and all this is downloadable for free on AAPIS on TV.com. And so it's, so these studies are, you know, it shows that our numbers are better, but our screen time is still low. So sure, you know, we're part of the TV regular, but like we're the like third or fourth side character, right? And relationships weren't as fully developed as other characters. So it's you think about like I think it's like 98% of the television shows. So we looked at both streaming, everything have white characters. But Asian Americans are, I think, you can only see them on maybe 50%. So if you're not watching those shows, you don't ever see an Asian, right? So no matter if we are, you know, about 4% now, or I'm sorry, 4 or 5% of, you know, representation, according to our population, US population, it's still like, we're not fully human as what we've been talking about today, you know? And so, yeah, and so my book, I mean, people are reading it in the industry, which is exciting. I know that Jason read it just last night. So it's a fast read. I wrote it, I'm an academic, but I wrote it for Hollywood. And I actually, I got I got called in to consult for a studio, and the studio head actually had read it, and I was like, what? so that's, I think that's just a dream come true, because I really wanted my work to change the industry. You can borrow it from the library too. A lot of libraries have them. I'm not trying to peddle my book. It's really just about getting the information out there. Actually, if you follow me on Twitter at Nancy Wyuen, I have one of the chapters for free for download, given that people are really interested all of a sudden in finding out how to be anti-racist. My entire book is really about how to be anti-racist in Hollywood. So yeah.
Wow, that's awesome. And it's really encouraging to hear that in the 4 years since your book first came out that we have seen progress, so I definitely don't take that for granted. Yeah, I'd love to hear from you guys too. I guess at this point in time currently, right, we've kind of set up our context, our vantage points, right, from where we're coming from, how we see ourselves being represented. So I'd love to hear from you kind of where the gaps still, right? How can we fill them? What are like the next steps that we can implore people with?
I guess I'll go first. I think that, I mean, we've talked a lot about several things so far, and I think the one that really gets like right to the middle of it is I think our massive gap is still how Asians fit into America. Like we're so other, we're so foreign, we're so alien, that it's hard to empathize with us. So we're also like a political tool, we're so politically convenient. And so we need a movie that is like, our boys in the hood, something that attaches us to, hey, look, like we've got American experiences that are real, that are really uncomfortable. And here's who we are. And we need to assert ourselves in that way, like own our stories, even if they are really uncomfortable. And that takes a lot of courage. I think it's taking like quite a bit of time, and it requires a lot of patience, but I do think that it's happening. So yeah, I think we just got to keep on going.
That's good. What do you think, Jason? Any thoughts?
I mean, though I'm optimistic, when you ask that question on the gap, it's so much. There's so many gaps everywhere. That's why like this is like we need as many people working in this industry, supporting the industry, supporting the content. Like there's just so much. I mean, one story that I have is that when I was working at Alibaba, and Hollywood studios see like, oh, Alibaba is this big Chinese company, dollar signs, and so they want to figure things out. But actually, I would say, going to meet with all the super high level executives at the studio, it's not genuine. They just want to see it as a way to get their movies and also their content that are monetized. They don't really care about telling better stories with Asian or Asian American characters. And I think also, and then also there's just, there's so much gatekeeping in this industry. And this industry is one that generally people who work in it, have come from some sort of privilege, because it's really tough to get into. And especially at the lower levels, with the pay in Hollywood, it's really hard to make it in this industry. So I spent some time, actually, I went to get my MBA. And then after my MBA, I actually did investment banking. And I actually told my business school classmates and also the people that I worked at in investment banking, actually, I think entertainment is a harder job, because not only are you working just as hard and you have to be smarter than other people, but you're getting paid half of what I would get paid on Wall Street or in finance. So it's really tough. But the good thing is that there are many ways to do it. And so I say it's kind of like a personal journey. I think one big thing is like, recently I've seen progress made. We have like the shows and the films that we've talked about. But I think one thing is also we need just a lot more I would say, from my perspective, executives and producers who understand how to and learn like how to bring these stories, films and television shows to life. And Hollywood is ever-changing thing, and there's 1,000 ways to bring something to life. But more people to be doing it and understand the nuances and really go deep and also understanding and thinking about what Asian American stories are and how they can fit into the broader context of America. Because the thing I like to say is, like, I'm so hesitant about using, usually for like my films, to describe them as Asian American, because I think of them as American stories. Like, they're universal, like, just great stories. And I wish also sometimes that we could label things less, but I also live in reality, and I understand that, you have to kind of, it is important also to sometimes, use that label, because there's so few of these stories. And I guess one more thing is that I want to say in terms of the gap is, let us not forget that actually there is so much history of Asian Americans in Hollywood. I was even surprised about that recently. Like, one book that people should check out is Arthur Dong's book, Hollywood Chinese. I mean, we forgot about that history, and we need to remember it, and we need to know that we have this long lineage. And I think that's important, because right now, though we think we have so much progress, that progress can be easily erased. So we can't just let up, and we have to keep going and have more of these stories and support these stories and just keep going and not forget about this history and make more history.
Yeah.
What you said, Jason, I think that Viet Thanh Nguyen, who's the award-winning novelist and professor, he said that we need to write as if we are in the majority. Like, our mindset needs to be that we're not in the minority, we're in the majority. So write with that confidence. So I think, what are we doing during this quarantine? I think we had a conversation yesterday, development, right? So I am actually writing a YA book. I've never written fiction before. So I love YA. I love it, love it, love it. I'm not a young adult anymore, but most of the young adult novelists are not young.
Is that
just
your
FYI.
first narrative that you're writing?
Huh?
That's
I'm writing.
First,
I mean, I don't even know.
the first narrative that you've ever written?
Huh?
The first narrative that you've written, as opposed to like
Yes,
academic.
first narrative. I've written nonfiction, as you guys have seen.
Go, Nancy.
Yeah.
Because why not, right? We're just shoot your shot, right? I mean, Kenny Leu, right? I think tweeted he wanted to be a superhero, like what, a full year before he became, cast in Shang-Chi. So I think
Manifest it.
We're in quarantine. I mean, it's really hard to write. I mean, I did not write for like the first, 3 months, but now I'm writing a lot, and just, we got to tell our stories. But I have these struggles, like, oh my gosh, if every love interest is Asian American, is it going to sell? Like, I'm thinking that, right? And that's not thinking in the majority, that's thinking in the minority, right? Like, are we going to get validated? But this is based on my life, and I grew up in Asia, America, in Southern California. Like, all my love interests, like, not 100%, but 90% were Asian American. So I haven't seen those stories told, right? Where actually an Asian American YA with the Asian American love interest. So, we got to just get our stories out there.
Yeah, write the world you want to see, Nancy. Just screw every other thought. Doesn't matter. Just do it.
She's doing it. I love it. That's awesome. I'm excited to read your novel, Nancy, and see the adaptation. That's so cool. Yeah, I think I received that, really well, even as a producer myself, and how I've seen that, yes, it starts in development, and there's also a lot of influence in casting and also crew. Shout out to Asian American crew members that work, above the line, below the line, whatever it is. I think it takes extra work for me to look for, people in the community to hire them and bring them in on projects, but it's worth it, and there's no one else better to do it. So I definitely take that sense of responsibility into even hiring crew. So yeah, I love everything that we're sharing. And I think as if there's any questions that come in, you know, we can take them one by one. But if you guys have any questions for each other that you're curious to ask, I know my biggest question is, you know, where do we go from here, right? How do we get more API stories out there? What can we share with our viewers, right? Whether they're a screenwriter waiting for their scripts to be read as they're in writer's block, or an actor that is struggling to still land roles or even get ones offered that feel right to them, or if there are executives watching that are trying to push for more representation, right, and face some of these challenges that we've touched on today, even at the executive level, trying to convince their peers and quantify our value. You know, what can we share? If you guys have anything you want to add.
So for producers and executives, I would encourage them to champion more stories with Asian perspectives. And when I say that, it can mean whatever they want it to mean or whatever you want it to mean, because it doesn't have to be an all Asian thing. But I think for Hollywood, there is this timidness among Asian executives to champion those stories, because then they don't want to be pigeonholed thinking, you know, first of all, do, you know, the superiors, do their bosses even recognize or think there's some worth there, or want to think there's value in those stories? But also they don't want to be pigeonholed thinking that they only can bring, you know, Asian stories. And I think that's like a very insidious kind of cycle, but I've seen it. So I would say that. But then another thing is, like, I'm so happy to hear what Nancy said, because I think that is what all of us can. And, you know, if you have that desire, do it. Because, you know, for actors, for example, just going out to auditions, you know, I'm not an actor, but just knowing the industry, there's not going to be enough roles for you, because we're coming from such behind. Like, they're going to only look at you for generally for Asian roles. And now maybe things are changing, but they're changing slowly. So write your own stories, and, you know, I don't know, even if they don't get made, but that can help you, like, be more confident in your voice. But maybe they will get made, and you can find a way to get it made. And right now there's more tools than ever before to do that. So I think we all have to just find ways to tell and share our stories. I mean, I've even said to some of my friends who are not in this industry at all, when I talk to them and I hear something interesting that I have, I was like, just write it down. Like, I'll come back to you, or you send it to me. Maybe there's something we can do here with this, because it's like really interesting life experience or an idea that they've had.
Nancy, Kenny, anything to add?
Oh yeah, definitely. There's a whole lot to say there. Yeah, first of all, I think, you know, just agents need to push past like what is written in the breakdowns, for sure, because maybe it's like sociological awareness or something, but then, like, you know, their image of us is just so limited, as I said before, that they need to realize that we're not one-dimensional, you know, like, we're not a political tool, we're human beings, and we can be anything. I think that's a big one. Secondly, I also want to point out the fact that, I mean, I came from outside of the whole entertainment industry, so I have a lot of friends who, you know, was the good Asian and like is an engineer now, or is working in a biotech firm, or is a lawyer, or in business. And I know that a lot of them wish that they had became an artist, but they feel like, and they want to push, you know, for Asian representation, but they don't know how. I need to remind them, like, if we have viewers out there that aren't in the industry, you know, we need you. You know, we need you to do everything that you can, because it's not just the writers, it's not just the actors, it's not just the producers, it's the people out there that need to speak up and say, like, hey, we want to see more stories like this. that's how it changes executives' minds, because they're looking at, well, what do people want? How do we make money off of them? So I think that is something that we did figure out, and Twitter's been very helpful in that. But at the same time, for example, I've got a friend who's a recruiter at a biotech firm in the Bay Area, and he was like, you know what, I'm gonna put my money where my mouth is, and he's going to we were doing like this independent like web series called Cat Loves LA, and he not just donated, but he was like, oh hey, I'm gonna volunteer my time and be a PA for you, like for a whole week. He flew himself down here, like put himself up in a hotel and just let himself be the lowliest position on a movie set, because he believed that this is what he wants. He believes that that's what he wants more in the world, so there's so many ways that we can give, it's especially the people that like want to channel like your artistic creativity somehow. There are so many ways. The second thing that I want to say is that it's our stories like can't be told by anybody else. Like we have made strides in representation, and we've got stories that are created by Hollywood, by white producers, white executives, and we have demanded that we have Asian roles in them. But to me, like true representation isn't that. Like they're not going to fully understand us. They never will. The only people that have that responsibility is us. So it goes to what Jason's saying, is that we have to write our own stories. Like it's our journey and it's our story to tell. So I want to encourage Nancy, kick that young author novel's ass.
Love
This
it.
sounds really gross, but I like it. I have to put that in there somewhere. No, bathroom humor, right? Get that YA bathroom humor mindset. I mean, when I lecture to undergraduate students, I mean, the easiest way to support is to go opening nights, right? And now that we're in quarantine, VOD, like buy those movies, right? That are, especially a lot of the independent movies are just kind of, you purchase them, and also Indiegogo, and all the kind of crowdsourcing. A lot of movies, like actually, if you think about Hair Love, which won the best Oscar for short, that was crowdsourced on Twitter. I remember that went around, and so you can actually invest in movies that can become an Oscar winner, right? And so and when you do that, you support those creators. And so it's actually really easy for every person to support, either financially or, as Kenny said, in kind, like actually going in and volunteering. I mean, anybody could be a production assistant, and it's like, I think people don't know that, right? People think of, although like, it's not as glamorous as you think it is. I was a production assistant in grad school for research, and I was vacuuming homes, because if you get a house and you film it's someone's house, you got to clean it up afterwards. And so that's what a PA does. So, but I was able to talk to actors. There's a lot of downtime on sets, if people didn't know. I don't know. It's like there's not enough. There's a lot of movies about Hollywood, but I don't think it shows how boring it is. And there's a lot of downtime. So people. That's why people smoke so much. They chain smoke, because there's nothing to do, right? And so people are just like hanging out. So yeah. So if people are want to volunteer and give their time, I mean, you can really talk to all the actors on set, because there's just so much downtime in between. I mean, I don't know how it is going to be post-COVID. I mean, obviously it's going to be a little different. But yeah, I mean, just support. There's so many ways to support. And I think also, word of mouth, because it used to be that Hollywood could try to do some sort of algorithm, whether something's going to hit. But now, because of word of mouth and social media, and also things like, Rotten Tomatoes, that, puts all the reviews together, every person has the ability to kind of make or break a film, depending on whether your tweet goes viral, right? So word of mouth is really important. That's why, I appreciate, you, Cindy, for asking for, you know, recommendations, right? Because hopefully we can recommend these things and people can see it and appreciate someone like Ha Jin, who's, you know, I think a total up and coming. I mean, he's already in the industry, but I mean, Asian Americans are perennially up and coming because, you know, you get to like, you know, Constance Wu or Down Day Kim level. I think people are, you know, people are still, it's like people that we know, you know, that amongst the community, we're like, oh my gosh, they're such big stars. Like I talk to people outside of Asian American community, like, who's that? You know? So I think it's just, yeah, just, you know, being that amplifier on social media.
One thing I do want to say on this is like, I mean, we were talking about like things that you can do small, like PA, but you know, you never know where those things can go because, I mean, Nancy, you mentioned Rotten Tomatoes. That's the Rotten Tomatoes story. Like it was a group of Asian Americans. One of them on their spare time, they were all working together at this one startup, but one of them had this passion. So on his spare time on one startup, this guy decided to aggregate movie reviews. And then they all got into it and it became a thing. And then it became Rotten Tomatoes. So you never know where these like small little ideas can go. They can, you know, so that's just another thing to throw out there.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think the more we're represented, even for any journalists out there watching this, if you write about us in the news, the fact that that can become a documentary, docu-series, because then people read those publications and, you know, we get told it doesn't have to, you know, be developed and turned into a script or anything like that. People write things off news articles or podcast episodes or things like that, just interesting stories that people can pick up on. So definitely there's a lot of ways to help no matter what industry you're from. So yeah, I've really appreciated this, you guys. And I think that just exhortation to have people move out of scarcity, right, and enter the mindset of the majority, I think is something we can really take away. Yeah, so thank you guys. This has been such an insightful conversation for me, right, to keep pushing the boundaries and ceilings of what's being written and produced. So thank you, Nancy, Kenny, Jason, just for taking the time to shed light to the TAFF community and beyond, right? So everyone stay in touch with us. You can find Kenny on Instagram and Facebook. What's your handle? At the Kenny Leu, right? Nancy, you can keep in touch with her on Twitter, Nancy Wyuen, and Jason on Twitter at Jason Lin I am. So yeah, stay in touch with TAFF on Facebook or Instagram too. You know, we have some upcoming events, including workshops on screenwriting and film finance, and more details on our festival. So thanks everyone.
Thank you, Cindy,
for
for putting this
coming
together. Thank you for all
Yeah.
your time and for the people behind the scenes doing this. This is amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah, it
absolutely.
was really awesome. Thank you all for having us, and it was so much fun talking to Nancy and Jason as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been really a blast, actually. I mean, quarantine, you know, we're all kind of lonely, but to sort of connect with like-minded folks who are creating and fighting the good fight, and all the people that are watching us out there who are, you know, just keep fighting the good fight.
Yeah, so good. Yeah, this was just a conversation I wanted to have on a Saturday afternoon. So I appreciate you guys jumping in. That's awesome. Cool.
Great.
See everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.